The year is 1193 CE. The sky over the plains of eastern India is not blue, it is a choking, swirling gray. For 3 full months, the sun has been blotted out by a column of smoke that rises higher than the Himalayas. The air for miles around smells of burnt clay, charred timber, and something else, the distinct, sickly sweet scent of millions of palm leaf manuscripts turning to ash. Below the smoke, the ground of a massive walled complex is stained with the blood of thousands of monks in saffron robes that have turned black with soot. A Turkish warlord, Bakhtiyar Khilji, sits on his war horse and watches the greatest beacon of knowledge in the Eastern world burn to the ground. He has just set fire to Nalanda Mahavihara, the university where the concept of zero was taught centuries before Europe knew how to count past 10. As the immense 9-story library towers collapse in a shower of sparks, we're forced to ask, was this just another brutal conquest in an age of endless war? Or was it a deliberate, calculated attempt to lobotomize the human race? To understand why a library burns, you must first understand why it was built. And Nalanda was not built by a priest, but by a king. The story begins in the 5th century CE, specifically around 427 AD. Europe was crumbling under the weight of the Dark Ages as the Roman Empire collapsed. But in India, civilization was at its absolute zenith. This was the Gupta Empire, the Golden Age of Indian history, a time when science, art, and philosophy were flush with royal gold. The man on the throne was Emperor Kumaragupta I. He was a monarch who had everything: armies, wealth, and territory. But history tells us he was a man deeply troubled by the burden of his own soul. He didn't want a fortress, he wanted an answer. He chose a spot in the kingdom of Magadha, a quiet, secluded mango grove known as Nalanda. The name itself is a riddle. Some say it means insatiable in giving. Others say it refers to the lotus flower, the symbol of wisdom rising from the mud. It began as a secret. It was not a bustling university open to the public. It was a royal retreat, a vihara, a monastery built with the emperor's private treasury. Kumaragupta endowed it with the tax revenue of hundreds of villages, ensuring that the monks who lived there would never have to beg for a bowl of rice. They had one job: to think. But this was dangerous. By funding a Buddhist monastery, a Hindu king was walking a political tightrope. He was blurring the lines between the state and the spirit. He wasn't just building a school, he was building a spiritual engine that he hoped would generate merit to protect his dynasty. The foundation stones were laid in secret ceremonies. The bricks were not the rough mud of the common people, but high-quality, kiln-fired red clay that would survive for a millennium. What rose from that mango grove was an anomaly, a place where the richest men on earth bowed down to the poorest, seeking a knowledge that gold could not buy. To call Nalanda a university is an insult to its scale. It was an intellectual city-state that dwarfed the academies of ancient Greece or the monasteries of medieval Europe. At its height, Nalanda was home to 10,000 students and 2,000 teachers. Let's put that into perspective. In the 7th century, the University of Oxford did not exist. The University of Paris would not be founded for another 500 years. The Library of Cambridge would eventually hold a few hundred books. Nalanda held 9 million. The campus stretched over 30 acres of red brick compounds surrounded by a high wall that acted like a fortress of solitude. It was a logistical marvel. Every day, the kitchens had to prepare 24,000 meals. The granaries held tons of rice collected from 200 vassal villages. The complex had its own drainage system, water clocks to keep precise time, and massive step wells that cooled the air during the scorching Indian summers. It was a place where you could walk for a mile and hear nothing but the low hum of chanting, the sound of 10,000 human brains working in unison. It was the Silicon Valley of the ancient world, a place where the primary export was not silk or spices, but pure, unadulterated logic. Most universities today exist to attract students. Nalanda was designed to repel them. It was not a school for beginners, it was a finishing school for masters. To gain admission, you didn't have to pass a written test, you had to survive a public interrogation. The university employed specific scholars known as Dwarapala, literally gatekeepers. But these men were not security guards holding spears. They were the sharpest logicians in the empire. Their job was to stand at the massive wooden gates and verbally dismantle anyone who tried to enter. Imagine the scene. A prospective student, perhaps a prince or a famous scholar from a distant land, would arrive at the walls, dusty and exhausted from months of travel. He would be met not with a welcome mat, but with a challenge. The gatekeeper would immediately launch a barrage of impossible questions. Define the nature of the soul. Defend the logic of the middle way. Refute the Vedas. Crowds would gather to watch this spectacle. It was a blood sport of the mind. The historical records from the Chinese traveler Xuanzang, who studied there, tell us the brutal statistics. 7 or 8 out of every 10 applicants were rejected on the spot. To fail was a public humiliation. Famous scholars who were respected in their home villages were sent packing, heads bowed in shame, defeated before they even stepped inside the courtyard. Only the top 20%, the geniuses who could parry the gatekeeper's logic, were allowed for the secondary interviews. Nalanda was an ivory tower where the door handle was set too high for ordinary men to reach. Once you passed the gatekeepers, you did not just walk into a library, you walked into a city of books. The library quarter of Nalanda was known as Dharma Ganja, the treasury of truth. It wasn't a single hall. It consisted of 3 colossal multi-story buildings named Ratnaranjaka, jewel-adorned, Ratnodadi, sea of jewels, and the most famous of them all, Ratnasagara, the ocean of jewels. The Ratnasagara was a monster of engineering. It stood 9 stories tall. In an age of mud huts and single-story temples, this was a skyscraper. Travelers reported that its copper roof dazzled in the sun and seemed to pierce the clouds. Inside these towers sat the hard drive of the human race, 9 million manuscripts. These were not sturdy leather-bound books like in Europe. They were fragile bundles of palm leaves, treated with oil to repel insects, tied with string and wrapped in protective silk cloth. The library was a labyrinth of spiral staircases and high shelves designed with a sophisticated ventilation system to keep the humidity from rotting the delicate leaves. It was the largest collection of information the world had ever seen or would see again until the invention of the printing press. We often picture monks sitting in silent prayer, eyes closed to the world. At Nalanda, the eyes were wide open, and the silence was shattered by the roar of debate. The curriculum here was not limited to Buddhism. To understand the mind of God, they believed you first had to understand the machinery of his creation. They studied Chikitsa Vidya, medicine, dissecting the human body. They studied Shilpa Sthana Vidya, the arts, engineering the massive temples. They even studied the stars, calculating eclipses with terrifying accuracy. But the crown jewel of Nalanda was Hetuvidya, the science of logic. Logic here was a weapon. The monks practiced a form of aggressive, stylized debate that looked more like a martial art than a classroom lesson. They used complex hand gestures to signal logical fallacies. They would spend days arguing over a single syllable in a Sanskrit text. The goal was to sharpen the mind until it became a razor capable of slicing through delusion. A student at Nalanda didn't just learn what to think, they learned how to think. They were taught that faith without logic was just superstition. In the courtyards of Nalanda, a bad argument was considered a sin, and a sharp counterpoint was the highest form of prayer. On the surface, Nalanda was a bastion of purity, vegetarianism, and strict celibacy. But if you knew which door to open, and if you knew the secret password, you would find a very different university. By the 8th century, a new, radical form of Buddhism had taken root here, Vajrayana, the thunderbolt vehicle, also known as Tantra. While the logicians tried to understand the universe through debate, the Tantrics tried to hack it through ritual. They believed that enlightenment didn't have to take a million lifetimes. They believed you could seize it in a single moment, like catching a lightning bolt if you were brave enough to break the rules. Deep in the windowless basement chambers of the monastery, elite masters met in secret circles. Here, the rules of polite society were inverted. They drank wine from cups made of human skulls, kapalas. They meditated in graveyards sitting on top of corpses. They worshipped terrifying, wrathful deities with necklaces of severed heads, gods who looked like demons, designed to scare the ego into submission. This wasn't black magic, though to an outsider it certainly looked like it. It was a high-stakes psychological technology. They were trying to desensitize themselves to fear and disgust, to realize that clean and dirty are just illusions of the mind. Nalanda became the global headquarters for this esoteric shadow science. Manuscripts describing levitation, invisibility, and the manipulation of life force were written in twilight codes, texts that made no sense unless a master whispered the key in your ear. It was dangerous knowledge. If the logic school was the mind of Nalanda, the Tantric school was its dark, beating heart. We might imagine university life as a time of social freedom. At Nalanda, life in the dormitories was closer to a maximum security prison, but one where the doors were locked from the inside. The students lived in massive, multi-story brick residential colleges called viharas. Each student was assigned a small stone cell. The luxury of the empire stopped at the doorframe. Inside, there was no furniture. You slept on a stone platform covered with a thin mat. You had a niche in the wall for your oil lamp and your books. That was it. The most terrifying rule of the dormitory was silence. Outside in the courtyards, you were encouraged to scream your arguments. But the moment you crossed the threshold into the living quarters, total silence was enforced. Thousands of young men lived shoulder to shoulder, yet the corridors were often as quiet as a tomb. The day began before sunrise, triggered by the beating of a massive bronze gong that echoed across the plains. There was no sleeping in. The schedule was relentless: meditation, bathing in the cold communal stepwells, a meager vegetarian meal eaten in silence, and then 14 hours of study. There was no music, no games, no romance. If a student was caught breaking the rules, drinking wine or sneaking out, they were expelled immediately, their robes stripped from them in front of the entire assembly. It was a brutal, monastic existence designed to crush the ego and leave behind only the intellect. If you stood in the central courtyard of Nalanda in the 7th century and looked at the faces around you, you would not just see Indians. You would see men with the features of the Korean peninsula, the steppes of Central Asia, the islands of Java, and the mountains of Tibet. Nalanda was the first true global university. For a scholar in Tang Dynasty China or Srivijaya Indonesia, Nalanda was a mythical place, a Western heaven where the pure truth resided. But getting there was a suicide mission. There were no flights, no trains, and no guarantee of safety. To reach Bihar, a Chinese student had to walk for years. The most famous of these pilgrims was Huanzong. His story is the stuff of legend, literally. His journey would later inspire the famous Chinese fantasy epic Journey to the West, The Monkey King. But the reality was far grittier than the fairy tale. Huangzong crossed the freezing passes of the Himalayas and the scorching sea of death in the Gobi Desert. He dodged bandits, starvation, and dehydration. He arrived at the gates of Nalanda in 637 AD, his skin burnt by the sun and his feet bleeding. He stayed for 5 years. He describes a campus that was deeply cosmopolitan. The Shailendra kings of Indonesia were so invested in Nalanda that they sent gold to build their own specific dormitory for Indonesian students. It was a hub of international diplomacy, where the currency was knowledge. But the cultural exchange was grueling. Foreign students had to master Sanskrit, a notoriously complex language, before they could even begin to study the texts. They spent their nights translating Chinese logic into Tibetan script. When Huangzong finally left to return to China, he didn't take gold or spices. He loaded 20 horses with 657 sacred texts. He was exporting the software of civilization. Education at Nalanda was completely free. Students did not pay a single copper coin for their food, their robes, their lodging, or their books. In a world where poverty was the norm, this sounds like a utopia. But Nalanda wasn't magic. It was a devastatingly effective economic machine. It operated as a state within a state. To support 10,000 intellectuals who produced nothing but thoughts, the university relied on an immense endowment. Kings of the Gupta and Pala dynasties granted the university the tax rights to 200 surrounding villages. Every single day, these villages were required to send supplies to the monastery gates. Records from the time list the daily intake: hundreds of pickles of rice, thousands of pounds of ghee, clarified butter, and fresh milk. The university was not just a school, it was a feudal landlord. The peasants in the fields of Bihar were not working for a king, they were working for the abbots. But the wealth didn't just come from rice. Nalanda was a magnet for royal guilt. Kings believed that donating to the university created karmic merit that would wash away the sins of their bloody conquests. They competed with each other to build the most lavish temples. The result was an accumulation of wealth that rivaled the treasury of the empire itself. The monastery walls hid vast storerooms filled with gold dust, fine silks from China, and gems from the south. The monks may have taken vows of poverty, owning nothing but 3 robes, but the institution they served was filthy rich. This wealth allowed Nalanda to become a patron of the arts. They built their own bronze foundries on campus, churning out exquisite metal statues of the Buddha that were exported all over Asia. They were an economic powerhouse, self-sufficient and sovereign. But in the end, this immense hoard of wealth would be their undoing. To a hungry warlord looking over the walls, Nalanda didn't look like a holy site. It looked like a bank vault waiting to be cracked. History teaches us that empires rarely die from murder. They usually die from suicide. Long before the invaders arrived, the golden light of Nalanda had already begun to flicker. By the 11th century, the cultural landscape of India was shifting beneath the monks' feet. For 1,000 years, Buddhism had been the dominant intellectual force. But a new wave of energy was rising, the Bhakti movement, a resurgence of Hindu philosophy led by brilliant reformers like Adi Shankara. The kings of India were changing their allegiance. The royal grants that had fed the university for centuries began to dry up. The villages that once sent rice now sent excuses. The Pala dynasty, the last great patron of Buddhism, was slowly crumbling, losing territory and wealth. You could see the decline in the bricks. Visitors in the late 1100s reported that the outer walls were in disrepair. The great copper roofs were tarnished. The once overflowing granaries were only half full. But the real rot was internal. Nalanda had become too rich, too comfortable, and too isolated. The monks had locked themselves in their ivory towers, obsessing over complex tantric rituals and abstract logic, disconnecting from the common people outside the walls. To the average farmer in Bihar, the university was no longer a holy site, it was a fortress of arrogant landlords. The university was sleepwalking. They believed their sanctity would protect them. They believed that because they were unarmed, no one would hurt them. They didn't notice that the world outside had become a much darker, sharper place. They were debating the nature of emptiness while a storm of iron was gathering on the western horizon. While the monks of Nalanda were debating the finer points of metaphysics, a very different kind of logic was sweeping across the Gangetic plains. It was the logic of steel, and it was brought by a man named Muhammad Bakhtiyar Khilji. Khilji was not a king, he was something more dangerous, a military entrepreneur. An Afghan general in service of the Ghurid Empire, he was a man of boundless ambition and zero nostalgia. He had been rejected by other armies for his strange physical appearance. Accounts say his arms were so long they reached his knees while standing, but he had forged a reputation as a commander who could move armies faster than rumors. In 1193, his scouts reported a massive walled fortification in the distance. To Khilji's military eye, Nalanda did not look like a university. It had high walls, massive granaries, and thousands of men inside. In his world, that was a fortress. There's a tragic irony here. Khilji was likely looking for gold and provisions to feed his war machine. He didn't necessarily hate books, he just didn't care about them. He was a man of action, colliding with a world of abstraction. His army was small. Some sources say he rode to the gates with only 200 heavy cavalry, but they were the Navy SEALs of their day. They rode Turkic horses that were faster and stronger than the local Indian breeds. They fired composite bows that could pierce armor from 100 yards away. As they crested the final hill and looked down at the red brick towers of the university, they didn't see a World Heritage Site. They saw a soft target. The monks inside were ringing bells for evening prayer, unaware that the sound they were hearing was the dinner bell for a pack of wolves. Why did they attack? Historians have debated this for centuries. Was it religious zealotry? A desire to erase a rival culture? The truth might be far simpler and far more tragic. It was a military error. Nalanda was a victim of its own architecture. To the Ghurid generals scanning the horizon, Nalanda checked every box of a military garrison. It was surrounded by a massive high brick wall, intended to keep the noise out, but looking exactly like a fortification designed to keep armies out. It had tall watchtowers, intended for stargazing, but looking exactly like defensive turrets. It was filled with thousands of men in identical uniforms, robes, intended for equality, but looking exactly like a standing army. Bakhtiyar Khilji was operating deep in enemy territory. He couldn't afford to leave a fortress full of soldiers behind his lines. He didn't know they were unarmed pacifists. He didn't know their uniforms were symbols of nonviolence. There is a legend that says Khilji fell ill and was treated by a Nalanda monk, but the timeline suggests the attack was swift and brutal. He saw a threat and he neutralized it. The irony is heartbreaking. The very walls built to protect the peace of the scholars became the reason for their death. The silence they cultivated was mistaken for secrecy, and when the order was given to charge, there was no one on the walls to wave a white flag, because the concept of surrender didn't exist in a place that had no enemies. When the gates shattered, the noise of the world rushed into the sanctuary. But what happened next was not a battle. A battle requires two sides fighting. This was an execution. The soldiers of Khilji poured into the courtyards, their swords already wet. They expected resistance. They expected the garrison to draw weapons and fight back. Instead, they found thousands of men simply sitting down. The monks of Nalanda were bound by vows of absolute non-violence, ahimsa. To kill, even in self-defense, was to destroy one's karma. So, as the cavalry charged, the monks didn't run, they didn't fight. They retreated to their meditation halls, sat in the lotus position, and chanted the Heart Sutra. The historical accounts are gruesome. The Persian chronicler Minhaj-i-Siraj wrote, "The greater number of the inhabitants of that place were Brahmins, and the whole of those Brahmins had their heads shaven, and they were all slain." The floors of the lecture halls, polished by centuries of bare feet, became slick with blood. The gatekeepers, who had once stumped scholars with logic, were cut down where they stood. The Tantric masters in the basements were dragged out into the light. It was a methodical, industrial slaughter. The intellect of an entire civilization was decapitated in a single afternoon. The slaughter was over by sunset, but the destruction was just beginning. The soldiers stripped the gold from the statues and the gems from the thrones. Then they turned their attention to the towers. They found millions of bundles of palm leaves. To an illiterate soldier from the steppes, these weren't scientific treasures, they were kindling. We have to pause and try to comprehend the sheer volume of fuel. The library towers were 9 stories high. They were packed floor to ceiling with 9 million manuscripts. The texts were written on dried palm leaves, which had been treated with oil for preservation. When the torches were thrown into the Ratna Sagara, ocean of jewels, the building didn't just catch fire, it exploded. The oil-soaked pages acted like accelerant. History records a terrifying fact. The library of Nalanda burned for 3 full months. This wasn't a normal fire, it was a geological event. The heat was so intense that it melted the brickwork. The smoke rose into a column so thick that villagers 50 miles away claimed the sun had been eaten by a demon. Day after day, week after week, the fire raged. It burned through the winter nights and into the spring. It was the longest continuous funeral in human history. For 90 days, the accumulated knowledge of the human race, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, logic, was converted into heat and light, and then, finally, into ash. When the fire finally died down, the ashes were knee-deep. But what exactly was in those ashes? We will never know for sure, but based on the surviving fragments that were copied in Tibet and China, we can make a terrifying guess. We didn't just lose religious chants, we lost the cutting edge of human science. Medicine. We likely lost the surgical encyclopedias of Shushruta and Charaka, which described surgical encyclopedias and cataract removal centuries before Europe. Astronomy. We lost star charts that tracked the movement of planets with a precision that wouldn't be matched until the telescope. Mathematics. The concept of zero and the decimal system were perfected here. Who knows what other mathematical breakthroughs, calculus perhaps, were sitting on those shelves waiting to be discovered. Nalanda was also a repository for Vimana Vidya, ancient texts that some claim described aerodynamics and flying machines. Whether myth or lost science, the blueprints are gone. The burning of Nalanda wasn't just a tragedy for India, it was a lobotomy for the human species. It is estimated that the destruction set Indian science back by at least 500 years. We are likely still trying to rediscover things today that were common knowledge in a brick room in Bihar in 1193.
After the fire finally exhausted itself, Nalanda did not rise again. There were attempts. A few brave survivors tried to patch the walls and keep the lamps lit, but the heart of the institution had stopped beating. The royal funding vanished. The scholars had either fled to the safety of Tibet or were buried in the courtyards. By the 14th century, the jungle began to take back what belonged to it. The most advanced university in the world slowly dissolved into a landscape of shapeless mounds. The massive brick towers, which had once scraped the sky, collapsed under the weight of monsoons and banyan trees. Roots curled around the statues of the Buddha like strangling snakes. For the local villagers living in the shadow of these ruins, the site became a place of terror. They forgot the name Nalanda. To them, it was just Bargan, a cursed graveyard. Folklore from the region tells us that the locals believed the ruins were haunted by the Rakshasas, demons, and the angry spirits of the slaughtered monks. They whispered that on moonless nights you could still hear the low humming sound of chanting coming from beneath the earth. They believed that if you took a single brick from the mound to build your own house, your family would fall ill. So, for 600 years, the site was protected by fear. Cows grazed on top of libraries that held the secrets of the universe. Children played on mounds of dirt that covered the ashes of the ocean of jewels. The world forgot. The silence was absolute. For centuries, Nalanda was a myth. It existed only in the yellowed pages of Chinese travel diaries. The locals in Bihar walked over the mounds every day, unaware they were stepping on the Oxford of the ancient world. The man who cracked the code was Sir Alexander Cunningham. He was the founding father of the Archaeological Survey of India, a British military engineer with an obsession for Buddhist history. In 1861, he arrived in the village of Bargan. He wasn't looking for gold, he was following a map. He held in his hands the translated journals of Huanzang, the Chinese pilgrim who had visited Nalanda 1,200 years earlier. Cunningham read the text like a set of GPS coordinates. Go 7 leagues south of the Ganges. Look for the stupa of Sariputra. Find the lotus tank. He looked at the shapeless mounds of dirt and saw the ghost of the city beneath. He ordered his men to dig. What they found stunned the Victorian world. As the workers cleared away centuries of jungle, the red brick walls began to emerge. They found the massive, thick walls of the monasteries. They found the blackened layers of ash from the Great Fire. They found the official seal of the university, Sri Nalanda Mahavihara Arya Bhikshu Sanghasya.
the venerable community of monks of Nalanda. It was the smoking gun. The myth was real. The British Empire, which prided itself on being the pinnacle of civilization, was forced to admit that while their ancestors were living in wooden huts, the Indians had been running a university with entrance exams and a library of 9 million books. For 800 years, Nalanda was a scar on the face of India, a reminder of what was lost. But ideas are harder to kill than buildings. While the library burned, the knowledge it held had already escaped. The software of Nalanda had been backed up in the monasteries of Tibet and the pagodas of China. The logic, the astronomy, and the philosophy survived in exile, nurturing civilizations across the Himalayas while India slept. But in the 21st century, the circle finally closed. In 2010, the Parliament of India passed a bill to do the impossible, to rebuild Nalanda. It wasn't just a construction project, it was an act of national resurrection. Nations that had once sent students to the ancient university, China, Japan, Singapore, and Thailand, came together to fund the new Nalanda University. It stands today just a few miles from the ancient ruins. It is a net-zero energy campus powered by the sun, built with red bricks that echo the past but house the future. The ruins of the old university still stand as a warning. They remind us that civilization is fragile. Knowledge is not guaranteed. It can be burned, broken, and forgotten. But as you walk through the silent red corridors of the excavation site today, you don't just feel the tragedy, you feel the persistence. The fire of 1193 destroyed the books, but it couldn't destroy the hunger to know. Nalanda is no longer a ghost. The lotus has risen from the mud once again.